In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Loving Father, we turn to you during this, on this feast day, this solemnity of St. Joseph, the patron of the Church, the patron of fathers and of workers. We ask in a particular way for St. Joseph's intercession to watch over your Church and to assist us in our efforts to follow the gospel, especially to give witness to the love of you and of our neighbor each day in all that we say and all that we do, the way that we engage our culture, authentically pointing to the truth that your Son has bestowed upon us. We ask all these things as we pray in the words that Jesus has taught us, his disciples, to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, a couple things. I think this, I was watching the lecture I gave on this topic last year on these readings, and I made some caveats at the beginning of that lecture. In fact, I had said at the beginning of that lecture last year that we should switch it with Dr. Thibault's lecture from last week, in that it might be better to have them in the opposite order. And then I think Avery and I forgot about that and put them in kept the order the same this year. But I think also just generally, this week is a little bit less target. I want to try and organize it a little bit more than I did last year, and I want to look at, I think particularly, I think it's called Church and Society right now is what it's called, and I think that's right. I think I'd like to look at some other writing on this to include next year. But I think that I think we need to, and this is really what we kind of I think what we need to look at really fundamentally is, what is the role of the Church in society? Like, what does it mean to be, what is a Christian approach to society? How do we understand what Jesus, what the implications are of the gospel in terms of how we, the responsibility we have to the world, right? And I think that there are, we could look at kind of two basic extremes that I think the Church has really navigated from the beginning, and we even see in the life of Christ himself, but we see it even prior to Jesus' own life. And the one being what we might call a kind of quietism, or spiritualization. Maybe that's another way of kind of putting it, right? Spiritualizing. And then the other extreme would be we might call it a politicization. Or yeah, we'll stay with politicization, maybe. Or it's like zealotry, kind of like to be a zealot, right? Kind of, although even that word you have to be careful, because you can be a zealot about good things, right? You can be zealous for the things of God. But so maybe we could leave it. So, how is it? I think there's a big question in our culture. I imagine many of you've gotten into a conversation with someone, and if you, for example, bring up an area of argument, a idea about the way that you think society should go, or that what you think is right or wrong, if you base that on a religious argument, in many cases that would be kind of, you'd be told you were imposing your religious beliefs on other people, right? And so part of the question becomes, well, is there really such a thing as a society where beliefs are not imposed on somebody? Like, I think one of the real challenges of our time is that in the name of sometimes a separation of church and state, what we end up with really is a kind of exclusion of religious beliefs that have their origin in a church from the public square, whereas religious beliefs that have their origin in another form of ideology are allowed. And if that makes sense. So, for example, if I was arguing, if I'm arguing any moral point in society, on any moral ground, it's based on a principle, right? A religious principle, really. If I believe you should do good and avoid evil. Well, there's no proof for that, right? Like, you can't say empirically somewhere in the world, I don't know where you'd prove that human beings need to do good and avoid evil. Like, that's an ought. The philosopher Hume, back in the 1800s, famously proved you can't get an ought from an is. So you can't go from, even if you were to say 99% of humans do good and avoid evil, you can't say that because 99% of humans do good and avoid evil, therefore you should do good and avoid evil. All you can say is that that's what 99% of humans do. But there's no moral, to say that this should somehow that this creates a moral mandate, right? A should, a moral responsibility onto an individual. You can't get from the preponderance of something, even if it was, and you can see the logical fallacy there, right? I mean, back in, I don't know, you could go to different societies when slavery was very common. And if slavery, the overwhelming majority of people here own slaves, therefore you should own slaves too. Well, it doesn't work, right? Moral principles don't correspond, they're not based on, and observable behavior. They're not based on just the experience of life. I was talking about this just recently in a homily because I think that we sometimes fall into this, right? In the sense of we would say, well, I can't tell my kids that this is a classic one, I can't tell my kids they shouldn't be cohabitating because we did it. And it's like, well, okay, so you're basically then saying that if you did anything wrong, you can't tell anyone not to do that thing? Is that really so like that kills like 90% of my homilies right there. Right? That's what I told them. I'm like, what am I going to preach about? Love your neighbor. Well, there goes that one. Like, oh, don't lose your temper. Well, that's off the table. Like, I mean, like, the reality is that we are being, the standard that we live by is not the standard of that we experience, right, in the world. We have that what we're called to is beyond our own, even beyond what we ourselves are capable of, right? Because it's really ultimately what has been revealed to us by God as the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. Like this is, as Christ says, this is who you are. This is what you're intended for. This, and what we in Evangelium Vitae, that hopefully the one of the readings didn't print out well, but Evangelium Vitae did. One of the things that John Paul II makes very clear in that encyclical is that this understanding of human dignity, for example, is not just something that is reserved to people who believe in Jesus Christ, but that a human being should be able to, using reason, understand that other human beings have dignity, that they not only that they have a dignity that that really ultimately, now they may not name it as such, but it ultimately comes from God in a participation in His, they are made in His image and likeness. But I think we have to, I think that what happens sometimes is that we're being, there's a kind of silencing of, when we look at the church, there's been a kind of silencing of the church in society, and really on these two planes of saying, hey, you're the church, so you're not operating within the realm of the political. Stay in your lane, and you can see this within a movement. I forget if I mentioned it here, but it was concerning, and I brought it up a lot of times. In the Obama administration, there was a very subtle move that in the way they started speaking about religious freedom. And so they said you have the freedom, we'd always talked about the freedom of religion. This started to be changed by the administration. And instead the administration started talking about freedom of, does anybody remember? Worship. Why is that problematic?
Well, because you can worship all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it, but the bigger problem is, where do you worship? In your church. If you only have the right to worship, then you can only really do your religious thing in your church.
Right. So you don't impact anybody else.
So freedom of religion is much bigger than freedom of worship. Freedom of religion means I have the right to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to preach the gospel, to try to influence society, to share the good news, to start universities. Right? I have the ability to advance a particular culture and a particular way of life. That's freedom of religion. Freedom of worship is you can gather on Sunday in your little clubhouse. Very restricted. And that was an intentional move. It wasn't just linguistic semantics. It was an intentional move. And there's freedom of worship there's been freedom of worship in China and all kinds of very oppressive regimes. You could go and worship God on Sunday in your church. Fine, no problem. But just don't even for a minute. In India right now, the anti-conversion laws that are in India, there are anti-conversion laws in many, many countries around the world. If you convert someone, you're in prison, or you get fined, and sometimes culturally, you might end up being lynched. But that's clearly not freedom of religion, right? If somebody can't convert, right? Yeah.
Also, I just looked up the First Amendment, and it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and then it goes on to free speech and all the other stuff. So specifically,
It's contrary to the constitutional right.
it's unconstitutional.
Correct. But it was a not so subtle, and it's interesting, in that same time, if you go to the U.S. Bishops' Conference, the U.S. Bishops' Conference was very concerned about the erosion of religious liberty and religious freedom at that time. This was also the time that the HHS mandate was being pushed out by the Obama administration. And I think some of that was probably also politically motivated as they're coming into a midterm election. They wanted to make the U.S. bishops fight for contraception. It's like a losing battle. So they wanted to basically push the bishops into defending contraceptives against the federal government requiring the U.S. bishops to pay for them, right? So pretty smart, right? You make it look absolutely absurd. You won't pay for these poor women's contraceptives. But the bishops felt like, what are we supposed to do here? You basically have said that we have to pay for something we see as gravely immoral. It's like you're directly attacking our ability to act according to our consciences, right? So this was part of so there's, on the one hand, kind of this pushing out of society and pushing into kind of a silo. And we already, in our country, we have kind of our Protestant ethos, right? Which already kind of sees religion as a matter of one's personal relationship with Jesus Christ and is not very socially contextualized. How do you become a Christian if you're an evangelical? You accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, right? You can do that in kind of an altar call. You make this, or you open your heart to Him, and His Holy Spirit is at work in you, and that's really what saves you, right? How do you become a Catholic? Ask Avery. It's like how many months, and you've got to come to the church, and then you've got the rite of acceptance, and somebody traces this cross on your head and your hands and your shoulders and all these other things, and you have to answer these questions in front of everybody, and then you got to come to another thing with the rite of election we just had last weekend with the bishop, and then you go through it's months, and the community's promise they're supposed to pray for you, and you're supposed to learn all these things about the community, and you make promises that you're going to be a part of this whole very clearly right from the beginning, this is not just about you and Jesus, right? So So our whole Protestant kind of ethos also has a tendency to kind of, for us to just think about, and I think that's part of what has even been, even before some of this erosion, we already had a kind of quietism within the United States. It was like, you keep your religion, what? You don't talk about sex, religion, politics, right? You kind of keep these things to yourself. It's not polite company. So I think that's, but I also think that there's been a kind of weird dichotomy, as I alluded to at the beginning here, or a weird distant that we were just talking about with the middle school students earlier. If you were to look at the universities when they first began, University of Paris, Bologna, all these universities, your study of religious truth would not have been sequestered from your study of mathematical truth, biological truth, economic truth. You were looking for truth. And so the study of God and the study of ethics, what's right and wrong, would not have been put into the category of taste. It was understood to be part of the category of that there's a real objective and universal character to the truth about who God is as well. Right? This is not just, well, you have your Zoroastrian whatever thing, and I have my. It was understood that no, like there are real religious beliefs that are misguided and some that are real, true, and you can learn those and become more aware of them, and more knowledgeable, or less. Whereas today, I think it's kind of, and I think you even see it with regard to. I mean, there's theological schools have really been pushed out of, like you wouldn't, and even just theological understanding and knowledge, right? Like if you have I think it's very much like philosophy, theology, those kinds of degrees would be much more considered as belonging within the social science, not even social sciences. Maybe something more along the lines of I think psychology would be considered, for example, to be much more serious than philosophy and theology. I think philosophy and theology today would be really understood more almost in the area of literature and, I don't know. Yeah, probably literature, right? Or something that would be really very cultural, art. Right, it's culture. You study it really in the sense of not in a searching for a particular truth. If you're learning about evolution, evolutionary biology, there are certain. If you propose certain things, you're going to be wrong. There's only the scientific evidence kind of says things happen in particular ways, and they don't happen in particular ways, and there are particular arguments and studies and ways of proceeding that have been that you have a body of wisdom that has been handed on, and if you're going to become a biologist, you need to master that body of that field of understanding, and then proceed along that path. Like mathematics would be the same thing. I mean, you can't say, well, 2 + 2 is 4 for you, but it's 5 for me, right? You can't. That's not the kind of thing that it is, right? There's an objective reality, and if you think that 2 + 2 is 5, then maybe mathematics is not the right path for you, right? Because that's just not the way it is. That's not real, right? That's not this field of knowledge. So I think that on the other hand, though, if you're like, well, who wrote a better symphony, Mozart or Beethoven? Well, now we're not talking in the same realm, right? Because now we're looking at a much more, what's better, wine or beer?
Right, it's more personal.
Right, now we're looking at really a more subjective experience that is qualified by the individual. Right? What's a better fruit, an apple or a banana? She just said apple. So my concern is that in our current, like what's happened, and is that we have moved into a realm where, and this was epitomized when I was in Bangor, and I don't know if I mentioned it here because I always talk about this too, but the kids were in our high school youth ministry were telling me about in the public school, I think some well-intentioned people had wanted to include some religious background in some religious texts in their instruction. And so, but the only way they could kind of get it into the public school curriculum was with Greek mythology and some of these other things. So the course title was Bible and Myth. And I was like, I told them, I was so frustrated. I was like, that's ridiculous. You might as well do like mathematics and myth, or biology and myth, or like, this is like, why do you think the Bible has any more in common with mythology than you do that, like, physics has something? I think the Bible has more in common with physics than with mythology. Right? So, but I think that there's been a kind of movement of, and this was intentional, right? During the so-called Enlightenment, part of the what happened in Europe was you had so many religious wars, right? If you think of what Hobbes and some of them were really reacting against, it was like we're killing each other over religion. So let's stop taking this so seriously. Like, you can have your religious clubhouse, we'll have ours. Let's all let's get it the heck out of the political realm and our common, our culture. And there's an interesting book I was reading, and I'd like to maybe incorporate some of it in, because I've read it. I'm halfway through it, but it actually points out that really the United States was part of that, right? The United States was part of that kind of Enlightenment thinking. And when the United States if you look at the Founding Fathers talking about the natural rights of man, and there's a whole, the author, I'm blanking on it right now, but the author goes into this whole question of where did this idea that we have natural rights, that the Founding Fathers spoke about these natural rights, but the issue here is, what is it in nature that actually bestows these rights upon you? Can nature give you rights? What is even meant by natural rights? It's like undefined. And what the author points to is that it was really just to move away from the idea of God being the source of our rights. And instead, it's like, well, we don't want to invoke God as the origin of our rights, so we are going to take a sidestep from that, and we're going to say they're just natural, even though we can't really define them or how we have them, but we don't want to invoke God in this whole question. The problem is that if you follow that out, because there's no defining, your natural rights can basically become, as we've seen, Now, human rights that are founded on this kind of natural rights argument, I mean, where do they end, right? We've added right after right after right, and now we're at a point where you have the right to your natural right to define your own gender, right? Where does it, like, there's no limiting factor, right? There's no limiting factor to where natural rights really become kind of basically a placeholder for whatever we want to do as a culture. Right? There's nothing really objective. It's an attempt to move to an objective thing, but there's nothing objective. So not to get overly, but I think that this has been an area that we've been no. So that's one side of the thing. And it's interesting that we are seeing both of these things. Now, on the other hand, you've got Donald Trump producing a Bible, right? So, and you have, it's very interesting to see like both political parties trotting out various religious figures to give invocations at their political conventions and whatnot. You see a lot of, and we've had, I mean, for example, you know, you'd say, well, we had some really kind of dicey things happen in Central America where you had priests who were taking up arms or who were being elected to public office. We've had, you know, we've had certainly in Europe different times where there was a real kind of movement of the church into the political realm that was not good, and although it's anyway, we could get into some of that. Why did that happen? It's always hard to say. Was it the church that, for example, in Europe, a lot of the political, powerful families made sure that one of their sons became a bishop. So then the question is, like, is it the church that got political, or was it the political system that used the church, or the political families, powers that wanted to use the church to accomplish their own purposes? I think you actually see generally within Christianity very few occasions where you would have, despite sometimes what's argued, where you have legitimate ecclesial or church using of a political system to accomplish its own purposes. And I think what you would see in those cases would be forced conversion, right? There are not many times, like if you look at the history of Christianity, Christians have not generally gone in and forced people to convert at the point of a sword. It's just not what we've done. Now, there's been times when there's been certainly influence, but the majority of the time there's been more that the political forces have used the church to further their own ends. But I think this is a bit of a departure from other faiths, but we haven't gone in and said, you are going to believe in the virgin birth now. like that's not really been a thing. And I think we, despite all of the arguments about religious persecution, or this oppression, like religious oppression of people, even in terms of moral behavior, how many, we were just talking about the Inquisition. People wanted to be tried by the Inquisition rather than
the government courts. So there was I think we have to be careful about some of the way that the church has been characterized as trying to get political. I mean, I guess you could just say I'm biased. But to me, I'm like, sometimes people talk about this. I'm like, when's the last time that you saw, do I have a police force? Can I make laws that impact people on the street? Like, if I'm such an oppressor, like, when's the last time that somebody got in trouble for not doing what the church says? Where's the oppression?
But these are modern times. You go back into the 1500s or the 1300s.
I think
weren't there occasions where the church did impose its views on people?
I think you would see that, and again, this is where it becomes challenging with regard to, was it Catholics who were, I mean, because if you're in a position where like everybody in the society is Catholic, right? So then the question becomes like, is it, to me, you'd have to see that oppression happening outwardly, right? It would not be like within so much. In the sense of, because you'd have to be going I suppose.
I mean, you have good Catholics and you have bad Catholics back when everybody was Catholic.
Right, and then it's hard to say, is it that is the persecution, or is the oppression, how much of that was based on, because where's the intrinsic rationale for it, right? To me, it doesn't exist within the gospel.
It does not.
And so then you'd have to say, well, if they're oppressing other people in the name of the church, then they have, by definition, stopped acting as members of the church. Fundamentally, they're at odds with what the church is actually all about.
Well, for instance, Pope Urban II, who organized the First Crusade, I mean, he was basically organizing an army to go to the mission was to go to free up the Holy Land, but virtually none of those crusades did that. I mean, they wound up oppressing a lot of people, even other Catholics along the way. Yeah. And the Byzantines and all that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of that. I mean, but...
Well, back in those times, it was quite a lot.
I mean, what we have to remember that Spain was under Islamic control for 500 years. Islam had come all the way to the borders of France, all the way to the borders of Hungary. The Middle East and Mediterranean had been Christian lands, and they had been forcibly converted. There was a great fear that Christianity could be wiped out. So it was, now granted, there were political interests, there was greed. When they sacked Constantinople, that was the Venetians that wanted their stuff, right? But again, you'd have to say, I think, we have to be careful. There really is not the concept of a holy war within Christianity. We don't have that concept. We don't believe in converting people or oppressing them to believe what we believe. And I mean, fundamentally, that's part of Jesus, like,
Well, all I'm saying, Father, is that during centuries past, not in the last 200 or 300 years, the church has been really focused on its mission. But back in 1000s to the 1500s, there were a lot of that's.
I don't know that we have any more bad Catholics now than we did then.
No, I think we have far fewer today.
No, I mean, I think we have far more bad Catholics now.
Well, at least they're not running around heading up armies and taking land and doing stuff like that happened 500 years ago.
Maybe not in the name of the but maybe not in the name of the church,
There's a lot of power.
but they're still Catholic. Right? I mean, this is the thing, right? It's like, I think we have to look at, like, the church was in a different place in society at that time because the church and there wasn't a separation. But we have a lot of, we have more Catholics in the Supreme Court now than we have ever. We have Catholics all through our government. We have Catholic politicians in countries all around the world. Are they living the gospel?
Many are.
Now, they may not be going out there hand in hand with the bishop, but they're, I think that, there's been less of a, because the church has less political influence, I think it's easy to, because the church had more political influence in the past, it would be easier to kind of, it's easier to equate the political ambitions of money and greed with the church than it is today.
I was going to say, I think that in the past, too, some of the political systems were religious, were Catholic, and like Catholic kings and queens, and that was a different, it was so involved politics, where now most countries have a secularized government, except for like Islamic governments. And so I think it's really taken on a different spin. I think now it's.
Oh, I agree. I mean, the church today is nothing like it was back in the.
Well, it's
1400s,
not, I
yeah.
mean, as a matter of government structure in almost all Western countries, it's not a formal part of the government.
Right.
I think it's not so much that the church is different, it's that the state is different.
Right. I agree with that.
In the sense that I think the church has actually not changed much at all. It's that governments have pushed, and the church is actually, I think the church is better for it and has actually advocated for that separation. But I think when it was in the interest, I think, and what we're talking about is really post collapse of the Roman Empire. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, because before the collapse of the Roman Empire saw absolutely no need to be involved with the church, right? The Roman Empire they saw the church as a liability. So the church was being oppressed or at least sidelined. Constantine, all of a sudden, the winds had changed. There are more Christians. Constantine sees that the church is maybe going to be helpful to him, so he decides to bring the church in, right? And then you see this kind of battling out for the next few hundred years. By the Middle Ages, it became clear to anyone who was involved in the political realm that the church had basically the land and the intellectual heritage, and so they wanted to control the church, and they kept. That was really until, if you think, at least the revolutions of it started. You could say the Enlightenment, really, right? And that was when the resources started to get pulled away from the church. And then but let me put it this way. If I had a church that was full of people and we were offering say 10 mass, like say my congregation was half the city of Portland. Okay? So my congregation's 20,000 people, including most of the people with the money. You don't think that the mayor would be talking to me more?
Yes, you gotta run.
You don't think the mayor would be coming up and wanting to just come by and say, "Hey, Father, how's it going?" So, is it that the church is not as interested in influencing the state, or is it that it's when the people have faith and the leadership of the church has authority that all of a sudden the world gets interested? When the church is weak and when the church has no authority, when people aren't interested in what the church has to say, surprise, surprise, politicians don't give a damn either. But when you had a Europe where 100% of the people are Catholic, then they're listening to their priests on Sunday, they're going to Mass every Sunday, all of a sudden, if you're a king, you want to be on the good side of that priest. So I don't know. I mean,
That's a good point. Very good.
as we become more and more secular, I mean, this is the interesting question, right? It's like and I think to the point, we could also, for the church, be like, oh, we've decided that we want a separation from the state. We've decided we don't want an earthly power, et cetera, et cetera. Is that really the case, or is it that people stopped believing? We've seen a really, really significant rise in a lack of authentic belief and authority of the church to actually influence people in their daily life and what they believe. And because of that loss of influence, then the state has simply just felt that it didn't need to have the church on its side anymore and didn't need to control the church. Whereas before it did. I mean, I think you see this now playing out in China, for example, where the church in China was such a small minority that the Chinese government really didn't, it just said stay underground. Well, it got to a certain point, it had enough influence, then the Chinese government said, no, we're going to ordain every bishop. We have to agree with all of that, because they realized that the church was having more of an influence on society, and they couldn't just let it do its own thing. So it's kind of but it is an interesting, again, how do these things relate, right? But what's interesting to me is, again, like there are some examples of this, but it's actually, if you wanted to see real politicization, and there have been times, but it would be when you have bishops like riding into battle, like the Pope like leading the army, like when you have when you have the church actually assuming to itself political authority, power, the papal states.
Who is it? Is it Gregory the Ninth, who's the Pope during Michelangelo's time? He wore a uniform most of the time.
Yeah.
An army uniform.
Yeah, he wore. Yeah.
He's more of a general than he was a pope.
So there certainly was, but again, how much of that is? It's hard to say. Some of that is because within Italy it gets really dicey with these noble families. When you live in Rome, you realize this, because you're there and you're like, oh yeah, that's the Villa Doria Pamphili, that's the Villa Borghese, you go to St. Peter's Basilica, and right on the front freaking facade of St. Peter's Basilica, Borgesius, not Peter, it's the family, Borgesius family. And I'm like, well, okay. And that was that era. I mean, was this really about the gospel? I mean, so there was a certain amount of this that was really Italian warlords that were using the church to accomplish their own family legacy, their own family political ambitions. So it's a little bit challenging in Italy because the church and the state were just so intertwined. But, okay. Hopefully, I mean, I think that so the question, and we actually had this big debate a little bit at a team meeting at Sacred Heart not too long ago, because somebody wanted me to weigh in more on the immigration battle by changing the intercessions, so that the intercessions, they wanted me to basically have the intercessions relate more directly to the what was going on politically in the country. And, I had said, these are the universal, there's a time when we can talk, but we have to be careful about getting into the specifics of policy as the church. The church has and I think that Jake Thibault mentioned this last week too, I think, right? Did he talk about, the church has the responsibility to talk about principles, but when you start getting into policy, it gets challenging, dicey. And I think that this is where, we've gotten into problems in the past as well. But I will say that coming out of that conversation, and I think a lot of clergy now, and just for a long time, and it depends which congregation you happen to be talking to at which given moment. When do you talk about abortion? When do you talk about, we just had this whole thing with paying for IVF, right? When do you talk about, when would an immigration thing become such that, the church needs to talk about? Who talks about it? How does the church engage with the political life of society, right? It's not an easy question to sift through. And then part of it is, that's, as a member of the clergy, I have a particular role. But what about a person, what about all of you, right? How do you, I remember, Susan Collins, for example, is a Catholic, sits in the pews, but says, well, I personally don't think abortion is right. It violates what I believe as a Catholic, but I want to represent my constituents. Is that a legitimate position for a Catholic to take? Avery's shaking her head in the back. But can Catholics kind of, what was the big Kennedy line, right? Remember John F. Kennedy was arguing, well, the Pope won't tell me what to do, right? I forget the line. He tried to really, because that was, of course, the big thing was you were a papist, and he got elected. Basically, part of what he had to say to get elected was to say, the Pope isn't going to have no influence over me. Well, is that really should a Catholic be willing to say that? The Pope's not going to have any influence over what I think or what I do in government. Well, so then what will? So now your moral judgment is based on what exactly? And so I think we are in this kind of it is an interesting question, right? How do you, as a Catholic, engage our society and in the political process? And is it illegitimate to bring your religious convictions into that process? But if so, how do you do that? And what does that look like? And some of you are attorneys or work within the Nate's on our legislature. He's state legislature. So, I mean, these are, like, this is not a theoretical question, right? Nate? It's like, he's like shrinking it. But
It's a tough question.
it's,
It is a very, very tough question.
it's a very tough question, I think part of this is it requires a real diligence and a real charity on the part of the church, and some clarity on what does it mean to be part of a society, and what does it mean to be a member of a part of the church. And Jesus notoriously refused to answer these questions. Like, this is kind of the interesting thing about this whole area, right? Is like they tried to get Jesus to weigh in on this kind of thing. They were like, should we pay the temple tax or not? Should we pay the tax? And he's like, They're like, what is the prompt with the, pay unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, to God what belongs to God. Well, that's a politician's answer if you ever wanted one. Like, it says nothing, really. Right? I mean, at least nothing to really guide our decision-making on this. Everything belongs to God. So what does that even mean? What belongs to Caesar? You didn't really clarify anything on that.
His face was on the coin.
Right.
Caesar, money.
I mean, but even, does that mean that the state isn't, so that God has nothing to say about what we do with our money?
No, he does.
So like, you can see how it, really what Jesus did is kind of sidestep the question. And why would Jesus sidestep the question? That becomes the question. It seems to me that part of this is, I think that there's a lot of nuance that requires us to, using prudence and reason, we have to really prayerfully and carefully engage the world. It's not the kind of thing that we can say, well, Jesus said you should do, 25% goes to Caesar and 75% to God. Right? But that this is, and I think this, we don't spend enough time as Catholics, I think sometimes, really thinking about, well, what is our, how do we understand our identity as Catholics in relation to our identity as members of a society and our obligations to each, and what does that look like?
I was just thinking, it's interesting. Am I correct that maybe the only time in the scriptures that Christ is shown using force is when he drove the money changers out of the temple?
Mm-hmm.
So he sidestepped the question about this nettlesome question about
Caesar.
Yeah, but he didn't sidestep the question about the corrupting influence of money in the church.
Right.
He was very clear.
And think about how he just rails on religious authorities. He rails on the Sadducees. He rails on the Pharisees. Don't do what they tell you. Or don't do what they do. I just read this yesterday. Don't do what they do. Listen, it's interesting. Do what they tell you, follow it, but don't follow their example.
I think it's more useful, because I very much, in both professional life and personal life, have a foot in the church and a foot in the secular world, all day, every day. And so I think about this quite a bit. What do I do here? And I think that if you think about it, if you hit somebody over the head with something, like a principle, you are never going to convince them that way. In fact, you're going to turn them in the opposite direction. And I think instead, for me, when I get overwhelmed by it because I don't understand it all, I think, okay, go back to the first two commandments and just think about that and act the way you should act to everybody, even if they annoy you because you don't agree with their political beliefs. Like, try to bring the argument down to that level where you're just engaging with a human being. I hear this all the time from people who talk about, politics and elections and who won. And so my response has always been, especially now, is I just say, well, whoever's in political office doesn't absolve you of your responsibilities as an individual person to act the way you should act and to treat your neighbor as the way you should treat your neighbor. No matter who's won the election, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I just try to bring it down to that level, and even in terms of immigration, because I don't know, the policy is so complicated, and I do, from my own work, having seen what I know happens, say, in court, and then what I see is in the newspaper, which is vastly, vastly different, and sometimes even dead wrong. Imagine how misinformed we are about the actual details of what's going on. So instead of arguing up here about all the stuff that I know don't know, and that other people don't know, so we're just kind of yelling at each other, I'll just say, like, for example, with immigration, I'll just say, well, I think we should treat people as human beings and not be inhumane to each other, no matter what the circumstance. Because it's not about, so that's just the way I have to deal with this, and say this is about a person-to-person thing, and not about me making policy or arguing for a policy which I don't even understand anyway. Because that's all.
Well, and I think this is an interesting, I think a certain amount of humility. I mean, everyone has basically become an expert in foreign policy, immigration, economics, healthcare, because we saw something on YouTube that told us. And I agree with you entirely that that's not justified by the kind of ways that I had every single time that I have been quoted or interviewed by somebody in the media, it's been wrong.
Yeah.
Like when the last time it happened with the Press Herald, they literally put words in my mouth that I didn't say. Like literally. Like it was not even, and then they had to retract it. I threw a hissy fit and made them retract it because it was so just completely not what I said. And so, I mean, why would I, to your point, like why would I believe that I really understand these things well? And then furthermore, is that really necessary for me to live according to the principles of the faith? Like, if I'm voting for someone, then there is some question about kind of, and I think this in the past, there used to be a lot more understanding that you vote for a person because they uphold certain principles. The policies, you didn't expect to understand the implications of all the policies. That's why you have politicians, so that they can learn about the policies and their implications. But you were supposed to elect somebody based on the principles that they espoused and their integrity as a human being, and then trust that they're going to take those principles and that integrity into the office and to navigate policy that's far more complicated than you were going to get in a 5-second soundbite. And I think we've done ourselves as an electorate an incredible disservice by trying to get our politicians to explain policy implications. I mean, I don't know, anyway, but every time I hear somebody say, $5 million is going to this, or $25 billion went to that, I'm like, that's gobbledygook. Like, this is just numbers out of context. I can almost 100% guarantee you mean nothing. I have no context to know what that number means. You just threw that out there. 20 murders happened this year. Well, how many happened last year? 50 or 2? How do I make any sense of that number?
Or the data's not even collected. When you go into those crime statistics, and they talk about like the police talk about the resolution of a case. So does that mean arrest, summons, prosecution? Does it mean a deferred disposition with a dismissal at the end? Like, how is the data collected when it's meaningless if you don't know what it says? And nobody knows what it says because it's just a soundbite. It's totally meaningless, I think.
So, I mean, I think though that again, this becomes a question of, okay, how do we navigate this? Because if you look at Evangelium Vitae, we are responsible for promoting a culture of life, as opposed to a culture of death. John Paul II was very clear on this. We have a social obligation. We have an obligation to society. So we can't just say, I'm going to go to church on Sunday and have my little prayer time and then kind of put this whole religious thing in brackets for the rest of the week. How do we navigate that in the world? That's really, I think, so what I want to look at, hopefully this hasn't been too boring. I've kind of hopefully set up the challenge here. And I think we'll take a little bit of time after and look at, okay, what are some principal distinctions that might help us to at least know where not to go, and to help us maybe get some sense of kind of where the general direction is that the church is teaching us, and where ultimately we also, I think, you see this all the way back to Jesus himself. So clearly in the world, but not of the world. How do we do that? How do we live this? So let's take 5 minutes. Does that work? This is one of the things that I find is, and obviously I think you wouldn't be sitting in this room if you didn't believe this, I imagine. But just to be clear, the role of the church is to change the beliefs of society, not, or let me put it this way. I put it in an email recently because I had another go around with someone about different things. Which is just, it's a constant, huh? Which it's hard. Catholics are called to judge the world according to the standard of Catholic teaching, not Catholic teaching according to the standard of the world. Period. If we don't believe that, then we really don't believe our faith. And I think if we're looking at, I think fundamentally a lot of Catholics are not honest about this. Because if you're looking at a given, say you're looking at something like contraception, which would be, I'm using it because it's very controversial. Why not? Wade right in. I'll look at the camera when I'm saying it. But if we're looking at the arguments about contraception, if I want to make an argument about contraception and say, that it's morally wrong or right, the Catholics that I hear that make an argument about contraception being morally right do not use Catholic arguments. They use arguments from society, and so they're really trying to change the church's teaching. That's a very different argument from making it, if you thought, well, based on the teaching of the gospel and of Jesus Christ as handed on to us through the centuries, in communion in the whole church, I am interpreting that to mean that contraception is permissible and good. Make me that argument. That's an argument that we can have then. But if the argument is society this, I think that, this, that, and the other thing, then I think a lot of Catholics are not seeing themselves as trying to evangelize. Like this is what we talk about, the new evangelization. And I say, well, where are our new evangelizers? How are we going to have a new evangelization if I don't have any new evangelizers? Half of our Catholics are better at changing the church into the world than they are more interested in changing the church into the world, to believe what the world believes, than they're interested in changing the world to believe what the church believes. And as long as we have more Catholics that are interested in the church changing to believe what the world believes than to change the world to believe what the church believes, then how the hell are we supposed to evangelize? Right? And so it's like, it's not going to work, right? It's not going to work. So I think, I was just, again, it's kind of like, and it is to me, this is, it goes back to even one of the first talks that I gave, and it has to do with ultimately with authority. And I think this is what is challenging for us to navigate as Catholics, is to say, okay, it's not just me and my interpretation of Jesus Christ if I'm a Catholic. Like, if I'm a Catholic, I believe that Christ began and founded a church, and that the church is apostolic. And that means that he handed on authority to bishops who have the obligation and responsibility to teach the faith unerringly, in union with the Pope, not individually, in union with the Pope, to teach the faith and hand on the faith until Jesus returns again. And if I'm out of line, if I'm out of union with them, then why am I departing from them? Who am I following that's diverging from the bishops? And can I make the argument that they have more authority? If the bishops are going this way, and I'm thinking I need to go this way, why? Who or what is making me think that? And do I have any reason to believe that that force has more authority than the bishops? And I don't know about you, but I don't know if I don't know of authority that would have more. I don't know who would have more authority than the bishops on matters of faith and morals.
So you don't think the bishops have ever slid the other way?
Not as a whole united with the Pope.
Okay.
You have to be careful about, because an individual bishop or an individual cleric can err, and an individual pope can err. And it doesn't mean, and even in the way that and this is why we talked a little bit, but I think we could do more. And this is something to look at for next year, but I think we could do more in terms of authority. How do we understand authority in the church, apostolic authority and magisterial authority? What does it mean? If the bishop comes out and tells me, I think, Father Seamus, you should be a vegan. The priests in the diocese should be vegans. Well, sorry, that's not really your prerogative. Health, dietary things are not, that's not within his purview. And I could be like, no, Bishop, that's not good for my health. Like, that's not within the realm of faith and morals. Okay? And especially if no other bishops, and the Pope didn't say that it was important to be a vegan. On the other hand, like, if he's saying something that is specific to matters of the, so for example, Juan Diego is a saint. Well, I can't be like, I don't think Juan Diego's not, I don't think he's a saint. I think he's just a regular guy. Mother Teresa, no, I don't believe she's a saint. Well, what? So or other areas that have directly to do with faith, matters of faith and morals. But it does get. So I want to step back though a little bit. I want to look at so maybe just I think it's important to just first of all just note how intrinsic society is to us. I mean, we are, and perhaps you could say, uniquely social and socialized. What other animal spends as much time growing up? Even like elephants. I mean, the most sophisticated animals do not need to be with their parents for very long. And a lot of them are like the parents are gone before they even hatch out of the egg or do anything. A lot of them are basically capable of doing everything they need to do, even if their parents died on day 2. Even you think about like a fawn. Now some who nurse, they need their mothers for a little while. Nursing mammals probably need their mothers for a little while. But otherwise, if they don't have to nurse, animals pretty much are capable of doing everything they need to do by the time they're weaned in order to become the animal they need to be.
They may not always survive on their own.
They may not. But it wouldn't be because they were neglected by their parents.
Right.
On the other hand, if you think about a human being, we have to learn how to speak. We just even to learn how to walk, to we need, I mean, at minimum you need at least, I think you need at least 7 years of having adult supervision in your life to survive. Like the minimum. At least. Just to survive. And that would have to be a pretty high, like if you were like wrecked on a desert island or whatever, they'd have to really work on helping you like learn how to prepare food and do all these things, but you need at least 7 years to make it. So you think about just to become a functioning human being, we are heavily, I don't think we even really think about it enough, but we are super socialized, super social, more than anything else, multiple times over. And I think this was somewhat also understated. We got a little bit infected by some things in the Enlightenment. Some of the other people, when you even look at the Baltimore Catechism, you start looking at who made me? God made me. Why did God make you? To know, love, and serve Him in this world, so I can be happy with Him in the next. Does that say anything about other people? Wait a minute. How can we know why God made us in isolation? It's not. That's a poverty of a particular time. And it was addressed in the New Catechism. The New Catechism is much more, and this was something that was really worked on to correct. I talked about this a little bit within de Lubac. His book, Catholicism, was foundational in the 40s of trying to bring, again, some of this understanding from the fathers of the church and to look at human beings in communion in terms of the natural connection that we have to one another. And it's interesting that scientifically we've become much, much more aware of this, just scientific discoveries. I mean, we now realize, like, my mom never tires of telling me that she has my cells in her body and I have her cells in my body still. We've talked, I don't know if we talked about that here, but, you know, like they found women who are like dealing with infections or illness, and the cells of their children are like fighting on their behalf in their bodies, like weird ways that we're connected physically to each other. And you think about like pheromones, like that all sounds kind of weird, but the way that they did this weird study where they took, I don't think I said this in maybe here. They took people and it's kind of a gross study. Did I say it here? They took people and they put one group of people on treadmills and they had them run really fast and get their heart rates up, but it was like joyful running and just, you know, sweat through their garment stuff. And then they had another group and they scared the crap out of them and put them under a ton of stress, sweat through their things. So then they took all that clothing, separated it, and then took people and blind tested, and they found that the cortisol is the stress hormone, that those who smelled the sweaty garments of the people who had been exposed to stress and fear, their cortisol shot up. Whereas those who smelled the sweat that was not,
Like it was empathic, the response.
yeah, well, like you can smell fear. Like, so we are connected to each other in ways we don't get. Or, you know, like anecdotal, like, you know, if women are all living together, they all go on the same cycle. We know these things happen. We don't know how. We don't know why. We have no idea. Like, we tend to think of ourselves very individualistically. And we do not understand the way that we're connected to each other or how we impact each other, even remotely. I was looking at, or I saw some little video thing, and it was a really fast video of a tree that fell over the road, and it was a time-lapse video of different cars showing up with all these guys getting out in various times with like chainsaws and things, and eventually they end up like carting this tree off the road, you know, in different pieces, and it's like human ant behavior, like basically like, and it like you watch it in time lapse, and you're like, yeah, it's kind of like ants. Like, we tend to think of ants as being really social. Ants are nothing compared to us. Like, we are far more social than ants. Like crazy more. The way that we work with each other, connect with each other, affect each other, we are oblivious to it. But and I think that this is why it's so important. We have to understand at the outset that we are not individuals in isolation, not a one of us, and so we are not going to go into a relationship with God as individuals either. None of us is just going to be like me and Jesus in my little bubble. That's not the way it is. And this is why John Paul II he's profoundly aware of this. This is why he's so keyed in on talking about culture. There's a culture of life and a culture of death. It's not just, oh, you're going to do this or you're going to do that. And this is not to be underestimated in terms of, you know, for me at least, I think, and this is something that a lot of Catholics are like, why aren't my kids going to church? Is it something I did wrong? And it's like, well, we do live in a culture of death. Like, did you think that wasn't going to affect them? If you're paddling upstream and you stop paddling, you go backwards. If you're paddling downstream and you stop paddling, you keep going the same direction. Some of the, we have to be cognizant of the impact we have on each other. And it's not insignificant. This is why the love of God and love of neighbor, as Christ taught us, cannot be separated. Because you're fundamentally, you cannot be an integrated human being if you're treating God and your neighbor differently. Because part of who you are is connected to your neighbor. And so you're not being, so I say that because, and I feel like this is something we just, it's really a struggle for us because we have become so much more individualistic, and it's hard for us, it's the water we swim in, it's hard for us to even notice it. It's hard for us to even pick up on how we just perceive ourselves in such isolation. And I think more than people have in the past, for sure. John Paul II, in other places, talked about this, that we've become alienated from our very selves. We don't really even know who we are. There's a kind of alienation. And I think a particular form of that alienation is not understanding how interconnected we are and to the people around us. So how do we live in society? And I put that thing.
The isolationism makes me
There it
think
is.
that it's sort of like being in the garden with Adam and Eve. It's like a way that we're hiding, really, isolation.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good intuition in the sense of what's the first thing that we do when we're not in a good place? We're not exactly wanting to go hang out with people. I was just talking. We had our first confession with the kiddos on Saturday, and that was part of what I was talking to them about. Was, I think that's. It's an interesting question in terms of why has society broken down? What came first? The breakdown of society or the breakdown of our relationship with God? Or we might even say our own moral virtue in living holy lives, because
Well, if we're independent, we don't have to answer to anything either, except ourselves. Right?
well, we decide right, this is the Adam and Eve thing. I'm going to decide what's right and wrong in my little world, and you all have to, not just you see where we are now is, not only do you have to let me decide that in my own world, you have to,
Be okay with it.
you have to acknowledge, you have to use the pronouns I want.
Mm-hmm.
I want my world to be this way, and you have to be a part of my world in the way I want you to be. And if you're not willing to be a part of the world in the way I want you to be, then you're oppressing me. It's like, well, wait a minute, I have a world too, right? So, don't I have a world? So how does this work? So then you can see then, right, how antagonistic this is to communion, though, because if it puts immediately, if I have a world and you have a world, and it's not us sharing the same world that God gave us, then one of our worlds is going to be a winner and one's going to be a loser. And there's no way that we're going to, it's Sartre. It's the oppressed and the oppressor. Sartre was slave and the master and slave, right? So it's this kind of like it's the same thing you get with Nietzsche. Once you get God out of the picture, once you remove that objective source of love and of a reference point and of truth, and there's no glue. There's nothing that can where we're going to be finding unity. And so it's basically either we're going to find unity under my will and you doing my will, or we're going to find unity under your will and me doing your will. And this is where you get the rise of modern political totalitarianism, because there's no pursuit of the common good as given to us by God. It's basically who's going to win, who's going to have power, who's going to have control. And it's all about power and control. Which is contrary to, so the catechism in the section we read talks about society really in two, so there are natural societies. And then it talks about what is called, natural societies, and where's my thing on that? There we go. Voluntary, voluntary societies. So, natural being really natural as opposed to voluntary, meaning that voluntary you choose, right? I mean, it's pretty clear. Natural you don't. So, your natural society, the primary natural society would be your family, right? You don't choose your family. And not just your nuclear family, but your extended family. So that's a natural society. Another natural society would be generally what we might call, not political per se, but your community, or it's a hard word. I'm going to use the Greek polis. It's basically the place where you live, right? It's your culture, the place where you live, the language you speak. It's kind of it's your
surround, almost like
your home base, where you're from, right? You don't choose that either. We might say kind of it's like the time you're born, like that's maybe part of it too. Although, again, society, your polis is the community around you, and the laws and the customs of that community, right? And also your religion to a degree, at least. But I think for a lot. This is an interesting one. It's kind of weird, but I think we would say it's interesting. Religion and religion kind of falls into both. It's for Catholics, it's kind of a natural society that then hopefully becomes voluntary. We might put it that way. So, and then within voluntary society, we would have what we would say are necessary for human flourishing. So even if you have these things, that doesn't mean you're going to survive. Right? And so voluntary societies would be economic, so your work. Social. Now, not social that are given, but social like the Holy Name Society and whatever, the VFW cultural. Cultural kind of can be both, although sometimes it's not. Recreational. And political. Political.
I mean, that sort of sits in both too, because you are educated by this community.
Yeah, education. Well, again, we're thinking about communities, so societies of people. Educational society tends to be transitory, I would think, like in the sense of you're only in school for like 12 years or 4 in a university or whatever. So the school might, I don't know, it's an interesting question of whether education today, I do think like in many respects, our voluntary societies have become, like, I think universities have really sought to make themselves, especially kind of sources of identity. Like you hear this all the time now. If you go to a freshman orientation at one of these, heck, it's not even an Ivy League, even a second tier Ivy League. I remember at Bowdoin, it was like, not everybody can get into Bowdoin. So you are part of a special community here. Yeah. Now you have special responsibilities to society because you are going to be an alumni of Bowdoin College. Mm-hmm. So there's a real sense that you are joining a society. I don't think that necessarily is always was always the case. Maybe you had some top tier universities that kind of operated that way, some of your Ivy Leagues or whatnot. But generally, like if you went to the University of Maine, it was like, yeah, whatever, you're getting a degree.
So maybe it really falls kind of more under the social piece of it in a way, then.
Yeah, it's an interesting, but I do think it's interesting how, it is maybe within the social bracket of being almost class to a degree, like.
But the piece that falls under the natural might be the language the things that you're learning, right, that are sort of, it's part of your education, but it's a different kind of education, right?
Yeah, again, I think society, remember, is the people. It's the people. It's the community. Or let me put it this way. It's the network of relationships. That's the society, right? It's the social capital. It's the way that you are connected. So this really describes like natural kinds of connections and then voluntary kinds of connections to other people. What's interesting to me is that in the past, parishes would have been much more in this camp, right? Because think about the difference when we had a much stronger sense of a territorial parish. So if you lived on the west end of Portland Peninsula, you are a cathedral parishioner. Period. Unless there was a street. Renee, our cook, talks about how they moved like 4 streets over, and all of a sudden she became a parishioner of Sacred Heart. 7th grade, her pastor would no longer accept her in the school at Cathedral. She had to transfer and become a student at the Sacred Heart School for her 8th grade year because she was in a different street, different parish. And now that obviously was kind of a draconian way to think of it, but at the same time, you can see how that would be much more natural. It's like, well, and this is Europe. Like when I was in Italy, like there's the Catholic Church is in the center of the town. I was in this little town, Longostrino, It's like, here's the courthouse, here's the police station, here's the cafe, here's the Catholic Church. They're all on the main center thing. And it was not like, it's like everybody's church. It's not like our little thing we kind of go to on Sunday. It's like, no, it's like you would understand the post office. It's just part of your community. And whether you are in a good place with God or a bad place, that church is the religious place. That's where you do your religious things. So it's just, you can see how that would be more of a given and not a voluntary choice. I like the people who go to this parish. Therefore, I'm going to become that parishioner. A parishioner there. Now there would be, it's interesting, and I think it's still, in the church, there are lay associations of the faithful that are not parish. So even if you think about, for example, the way that the church is structured is as a society, the church is its own society, right? So you have the territorial context of the church. So the bishop he is responsible for the territory of Maine, right? So that kind of is that's his society that he is responsible for, is all the people in Maine, not just the Catholics. He's responsible for spreading the gospel to all the people in Maine. Like that's his responsibility. That's the society that is entrusted to his care. And he then recruits and trains and ordains clergy to assist him in that responsibility. That's what the bishop does. Now, there are voluntary associations like religious communities, the Jesuits. They don't have a particular place. Like they're not the bishop of anything. They don't have a particular territory. They have a particular mission they choose to be a part of. So the men who become Jesuits, they want to follow the gospel in the vision of St. Ignatius. And they want to follow that particular way that he contributed to the life of the church. So they go through formation and become a Jesuit, and then they go wherever, right? And so the diocese and the bishops really serve as kind of the natural, if you will, givens of the church. And then religious communities come and go. Do you need a religious, if the Jesuits, forgive me, when the Jesuits were suppressed, did that affect the overall vitality of the church in terms of its ability to do what it needs to do to bring people to heaven? No, not really, in the sense that it could celebrate all the sacraments, it could preach the faith, do everything else. If, for whatever reason, their charism, which I don't see happening anytime, if their charism was no longer needed in the church. Now, this has happened, for example, in cases where there were religious communities that were founded to deal with, say, for example, they were helping say they were caring for lepers. That's all they did. That was their whole purpose. The saint who founded their order was just the whole focus of this community was to care for lepers, and there are no lepers anymore. Well, then the order goes away because it's voluntary. It doesn't need to exist. The thing it was created for isn't there anymore, right? So the church has a certain amount of within itself. And we could argue to a degree, like parishes are kind of that way, even dioceses to a certain degree, but they're based really more on natural. They're based. The diocese mirrors the natural configurations of society. So, like, if for what like there were a lot of dioceses in North Africa that after they were overtaken by Islam, the dioceses were suppressed. So the diocese no longer exists. Right, because there are no Christians there anymore. In fact, the tradition was always that an auxiliary bishop would be named a bishop of one of those suppressed dioceses, which doesn't really exist in fact any longer. But there are hundreds of dioceses that have existed in the past and were basically suppressed because people got wiped out, either wiped out or just converted. Right, so they're especially in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean area. I mean, it's possible that our own, if we continued on this trajectory, that they could suppress dioceses in the United States. I think you'll see it in Europe for sure. Where, for example, Portland, Burlington, and Manchester could revert back to Boston and be suppressed. And all the priests of those dioceses would become priests of the Diocese of Boston, or the Archdiocese of Boston. Right? So the structure exists to serve the natural realities on the ground. But anyway, that's a bit of a sidebar. So the church mirrors the natural or the natural way that people connect with each other. So if people are connected to each other naturally, the church we don't create a separate society, right? It's not like the church is creating a separate entity and then supplanting or replacing. As Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. So the church doesn't, it's not like the church says, well, your old family isn't really your family anymore. We're your new family. You no longer have a father and a mother and siblings because, the priest is now your family. Or like this is like, we're like, oh, that's a cult, right? So but we kind of take this for granted, right? That the church is like, well, honestly, we don't supplant the natural societies of your life, right? You don't have to move into a commune to become a Christian, right? Like you can live in the same house you've always lived in. You don't have to get a new job in a Catholic company to become Catholic. Or now there are some, you don't have to get a different culture, right? You don't have to start new hobbies, unless if there were things that were directly that contradicted, right, the Catholic faith. Shouldn't be a Freemason. There are certain things that are contradictory, right? But generally the church, and this is again from what our Lord, he didn't come to overthrow the Romans. He didn't come to overthrow. It's not on the same. This is not the church is not a society among societies. Right? That's not what the church is. And so I think that's really important. And it's not, and this is the Polish, this is also, the Polish, there are laws, right, that govern secular or the natural society. The church doesn't. Now we discussed there were some forays into the papal states, for example. But generally, and even in those cases, there would be a distinction made between the laws that governed a particular place and people and the laws that govern the church, or canon law. Canon law would be different from Roman law or secular law. It's interesting though, there is again with the church having its own social, canon law it regulates the sacraments, right? So we, as we talked about before, there are rules of how we go about and how we live as a society that is in but not of the world. What would be some key, how do we navigate? So hopefully that's somewhat. One of the things that I want to mention here is, notice that, so the one thing that the church is going to be really opposed to is totalitarianism, which we talked about a little bit in connection to AI. Don't worry, Avery, I'm not going to get on AI again. But we talked about, but I do think that there's a reason that recently, nobody was worried about totalitarianism in the church 500 years ago. It wasn't possible. You simply did not have the means to control society or to centralize in the way that the modern nation state, think about even, I mean, Italy has only existed, the section of nations that we see in modern Europe happened in the middle of the 1800s, right? You couldn't rule, you just couldn't control vast nations with that many people without the technology that started to be developed with the Industrial Revolution. It just wasn't possible. Even in this country, states were far more autonomous because you couldn't have a strong centralized government. It just didn't, there was no way to do it. And I think that, what did that mean? It meant that you had all of these societies within your society had to take different chunks of what was going on in the world. So your first 7 years, your family played a really critical, important role in your early life because it had to. Your workplace played a critical role in your life. If you were, you think about now, there's so much regulation of your workplace that the moral character of your boss, if they're a complete jerk or if they're incredibly good, they both follow the same HR rules. And so even a really morally upright boss is going to have to be very careful about what he or she says to you, because the HR department's going to tell them, you need to make sure you document everything. And even a draconian, horrible person who's your boss is going to have to follow the same HR rules. Well, that's because we're so centralized. But if you were to go back 150 years ago, if you had a bad boss, your life was hell. And if you had a good boss, your life was great. So much more really depended on your particular boss. And we could go, so even within a sphere that is not, it wouldn't seem as economically centralized, but it is. And I think so, but particularly the family, religion, all of these things, they carried a lot more weight. And our lives, was it here I was talking about? No, maybe not here. Nesbitt, there's an interesting book by Robert Nesbitt, and I think I might want to include some of this next, but it's called The Quest for Community. Is that what it's called? Nesbitt. Can you look that up, Avery?
Yeah.
I think it's called The Quest for Community. He wrote an interesting book about this, and it really comes down to what he says is totalitarianism is the wiping out of all of these kind of smaller societies within society and the supplanting of them. Is it The Quest for Community? It is. He wrote it like in the 60s. Nesbitt was a sociologist at California, Berkeley. Berkeley? I think it was Berkeley, California. But it's fascinating. But anyway, he sees it happening. But what you have is, so the guild gone. All of the your neighborhood associations, your families. He talked like this, I think it was him, he was talking about like, this whole idea of like work-life balance. It's like that's a modern phenomenon, because in the past, your work was your life. Like you wouldn't have seen your work as competing with your family. Your family gave you your work, and your work gave you your family. Like these things were integrated. Most, like a lot of people, like how did they get their work? Well, because I'm doing what my dad did or my mom did. Like that was what you grew up. Dad's a farmer, you're a farmer. Your dad's a carpenter, you're a carpenter. Like that's how it works. Until the factory comes, and then that throws this whole thing off. But until the factories, that was like what your family gave you your job. So. We often, and he makes the point, I think, of like we talk about the decline of the family, and we look at how families have really been under pressure, marriages have been under pressure. We look at how commitment is under pressure. Well, some of this becomes a question of how much of this is or how much of this unraveling is really within our ability to live in these kinds of societies. Is basically because these societies are all under pressure. Families now are not dictating to, like families don't have as much control. I mean, if you look at talk to anybody, you talk to a teacher, and they're like, I can't teach my students because I got all these requirements that come from state and federal sources. You talk to a healthcare provider who's talk to a doctor. They can't relate to the patient. They have all these insurance companies, yeah, regulations, everything else. There's no way 150 years ago that anyone could have that kind of control. We didn't have the technology to be able to do that. You talk to any of these different fields, right? And so the problem is, and Nesbitt points to this, he says, by increasing this control and centralizing it, it's totalitarianism. Totalitarian means basically that the state becomes your life. And in totalitarianism, you have two things basically. All of this gets wiped out, and you have the state and the individual. And I think we could, it's easy to kind of say, oh, free market capitalism or communism, collectivism. I think what we've found in since Marx is basically that the two things are the same. Like, if you go in the direction of free market capitalism, they take over the government and control everything, and you get totalitarianism. And if you go in the direction of collectivism, they take over the means of production and they control everything. So, like if you go to either extreme, it's basically totalitarian under one form or another, right? So the danger is not communism or free market capitalism. The danger is totalitarianism. The danger is wiping out all of this, because this is going to fix. One entity is going to do everything. And, then this is why, like so often in our culture today, any social ill, and look, we see this, I don't care if it's the right or the left. It's a really interesting thing when you think about the debates, right? You have a presidential debate. There's no question of should the government do it. You bring up like, we've got a huge problem with addiction. Okay, well, here's my plan. There's no question of like, should we be trying to help families deal with this? What do families need as far as resources so they can help their children who have addiction and their relatives? We got a problem with education. We need new requirements. We need to spend more money. We need more teachers. We need this. We need that. Well, maybe we need to strengthen we need to just let our teachers do it. Give schools the ability to do what they do. But you see it on both sides, right? Is this kind of, and so the church, now, if you go to the real extreme here, you get like anarchy, right? Which is, although it's interesting, this is kind of anarchy. It's not so much, but if you look at libertarians, libertarianism would really you get the state should just what was it? Jefferson said the federal government should deliver the mail and police the borders and basically not do anything else. The church does understand that there are things. Now this came up last week, right, with Professor Tebow. But this is where the principle of subsidiarity comes in, because the state should respect the connections of society and not infringe on those connections, that social matrix, unless it is broken. And even if it is broken, it should try and repair it before it tries to replace. Because let's be honest, who can replace a father? Who can replace a mother? Not the state. The best you're going to do is help someone to kind of get through. Same with who can replace a good job? You do unemployment, but that's not the dignity of work, right? You can't just all of a sudden make somebody's life better because they lost their job, right? No, they need a job, a good job. And it's the same with any of these areas. The state should not replace or wipe them out, but instead foster a society in which these things can be vital and thrive. Exactly. And what is the church's role in all of this? Is on a supernatural level to foster the spiritual environment that allows all of these things to thrive. Right? To say the church is not to replace the family, it's not to replace the civil society, it's not to replace the economy. The church has the role of helping to provide the moral and theological underpinning that will allow society, these connections, this closeness, really the love us to love each other. Teach us how to do that. Show us how to do that. Remind us how to do that. Help us to be encouraged to do that. Provide the be a place where the sacraments can be celebrated and can foster this life that we have together. But it's not to replace or to supplant or undermine certainly any of that, right? But instead to serve it, to be of service to it. So I think what you see is that this is really what's meant when the church talks about in Rerum Novarum, when the church talks about the common good and following in Catholic social teaching. By the common good, what the church means is this rich matrix of societies within society that allow human flourishing to happen. Right? That's really what we're talking about, the common good. And that and the church's understanding is that the state, so the problem with totalitarianism is that when you lose the principle of subsidiarity and you lose this understanding of the common good, that's the common good rooted in the dignity of the human person, right? So the common good exists to serve the individual's dignity. Why do we have the common good? So that little Joey who is born in Portland, Maine, can be treated with dignity as a son of the living God and not as an animal or an inanimate object. The entire common good exists to serve every individual person within society. This reverses that. It's a now the common good becomes not for the sake of the individual human being and their dignity, made in the image and likeness of God. No, the common good is the functioning of the state, or the success, or whatever the progress, whatever the goals of the state. So if you get in the way of Stalin and you're an individual or a family, right? If your company is a problem, your job, your recreation, whatever it might be, because the individuals, the goal of the government is no longer to serve the individuals of society and to give them and to help foster a culture that gives them life, but instead the common good has been twisted into a kind of society that allows for the functioning and profit and efficiency of a centralized totalitarian system. This is exactly what John Paul II saw in Evangelium Vitae in 1995. That's 30 years ago. And he was very concerned about it. He saw this as symptomatic. He saw beneath abortion, euthanasia, contraception, all the attacks on human life, this looming. Because people were being treated as, not just because these natural societies were being neglected, and then rather than dealing with the problems in these natural societies like the family, the community, the economy, the culture, all these things, when they were breaking down, what was happening is, well, you're not married and you have a kid out of wedlock and everything's not supporting you, here's an abortion. So instead of serving the individual, the dignity of the human person, that starts to get reversed in the goals of the economy and the nation state, and you know, I mean, they're completely wedded. I mean, centralized economy, centralized government. It's pretty much. I mean, that's pretty much what has been the case for a while now. Why is it that people have been getting so concerned? I saw a poll the other day. It was like 45% of people think we're headed in the right direction. That's like the highest number since like 2004. I mean, if that's 45%, that means like over 50% say we're headed in the wrong direction. So, I mean, we've been thinking for a while as a culture that we were headed in the wrong direction. And I think a big part of it is because we can feel it. That all these connections that we have with each other that are important in our families, in our workplaces, in our community, our culture, the recreational things, they're under stress. They've been eroded. They've been degraded, and they're not being supported. And we're struggling to maintain those connections. And that's something that the church falls victim to as well, right? I don't know if you've read Robert Putnam. He wrote a book, Bowling Alone, came out in 2000. It's a Harvard sociologist. He traced this unraveling of what he called social capital beginning in 1960. And just demonstrates, it's kind of a boring book because it's just like one sociological study after another. And he wrote another book 10 years later, I think, called American Grace, I think, which is looking specifically at religion, because one of the things that he talked about was that, and this is, I think, really important for us as Catholics to think about, is are we seeing a loss of faith in our culture, or are we seeing a loss of social connections? Is it that people believe in God less than they did 100 years ago? Or is it that their belief in God is not being lived out in a communal setting, in a religious society any longer? That's a different question, right? How this whole rise of the I'm spiritual but not religious thing, right? I think it's probably a little bit of both, but but I think that's really what we need to think about. What time is it? Oh, jeepers. Well, what I will just kind of close with in Evangelium Vitae. This is John Paul II. Again, he talks about one of the things he says, paragraph 34. I thought this is really important. He wrote, "Life is all good. This is why an instinctive perception, or this is an instinctive perception and a fact of experience, and man is called to grasp the profound reason why this is so. Why is life a good? This question is found everywhere in the Bible. From the very first pages, it receives a powerful and amazing answer. The life which God gives man is quite different from the life of all other living creatures, inasmuch as man, although formed from the dust of the earth, is a manifestation of God in the world, a sign of his presence, a trace of his glory." And I think this fundamental core belief, Christian belief, this anthropocentrism, I might call it, it means, John Paul II hammered on this in Love and Responsibility in terms of our sexual ethics. You can never treat a human being as a means to an end. A human being is never a thing. You use things. You love people. You love persons, you use things. If you get that wrong, all hell's going to break loose. If you want the fundamental definition of a culture of death, it's when we start using things or when we start using people and loving things. That's a culture of death. When you use people, love things. A culture of life, use things, love people. And I think that's where he's calling this out, and that also requires, I think, an embrace of the cross, because it's not always easy. I'm reminded, I mentioned this last year. Have you seen those "Life is Good" shirts?
Mm-hmm.
But they always have like somebody playing golf, or like
They're all happy though.
they're all happy. They're on a sailboat. They're doing some recreational thing. But I think really what Christianity and why? Because Jesus entered into everything, even death, suffering, misery, betrayal, every kind of human thing. God showed us that when those things are experienced by a human being, made in his image and likeness, and unified with him, that they can be and are, in fact, good. It's not just the sailboats and the golf. That life is good even when it's miserable for a human being. There's no such thing as
as hopeless suffering. Like, and that's, think about the arguments for abortion. Well, this child's life is going to be so horrible. This is going to, think about all the horrible, the arguments that are made to diminish or to end human life, the attacks against human life and dignity almost always center around some kind of argument that says, because of this misery, because of this suffering, because of this,
Of the child or the mother.
or someone,
Right.
life is not worth living. Either someone's life, or
Well, it's the
if
argument behind
this person might
euthanasia
cause,
and
it's the
stuff.
argument of euthanasia, it's the argument of the death penalty, it's the argument of every assault against human life basically says some form of this argument that life is only good up to a certain point. And if it crosses this, whatever this point is of misery, then it's no longer good. And to that, Christianity makes a decisive, there's a decisive rejection. It says, no, life is good to the point of death. As long as you're alive, it's good.
Yet we try to prolong life sometimes with machines and things, right?
Which is, again, good to the point when, but we should only promote life, again, in the interest of the person. If we're promoting their life because we want to feel better, then that's not loving that person. If we're prolonging their life because we want to harvest their organs, or if we're prolonging their life because we want to do, well, we're prolonging their life for illegitimate
Or to keep
reasons.
us from suffering their loss, the loss of
Right. So I think, if you, hopefully, I know this talk is a little bit less systematic, it's not super systematic, but we, as I said earlier, the responsibility of all Catholics is not to change the teaching of the Church to suit the culture. But to, through prayerful discernment, try to help our culture to be more open and receptive to the teaching of the gospel, which is fundamentally nothing other than the truth, right? It's not my taste, my religious taste. I kind of like the idea of this, but to say, this is the truth about who we are as human beings. And we have a responsibility to try and share that. And to, in our own sphere of influence, try and help that to impact the people around us and in our society, so it becomes more and more a society moving toward life and away from death. So, hopefully that makes some sense. I know some of you are on the front lines of this all the time. It's easier, in some ways, it's easy for me to say these things from the pulpit, but and I think this is something that sometimes is lost on people, is like, they think that the priest is on the front line. The priest is not the front line. The priest is the back. The bishop is the general. I'm one of the officers, but the front line, boots on the ground, the foot soldiers who are in the trenches, that's all of you. And because you're out where the real battles are fought every day. And that's why you need the sacraments. That's why I have the responsibility to provide you with the sacraments, to make sure you have access to the sacraments, to make sure you have everything you need to be able to live out your faith in a very messy world. Right? So, hopefully that makes some sense.
There was a guy, I don't know if anybody remembers, in 2010, there was a young man who had mental health problems, who lit himself on fire in Longfellow struggle, and then he ended it. It was very moving. He said, God gave me David to love. And so when you think about kind of the way we're connected and the way we impact people, it's almost like Flannery O'Connor, you know, where she writes about people who have these interactions that are really puzzling, but they have these ripple effect on people around them that you don't even understand at the time. And I thought that was really an incredible thing. But so people on the outside look at things and they make judgments about the value of somebody's life without knowing what's going on, and they don't have the whole picture, and they don't have the whole arc of the story, because nobody knows it but God, really.
Well, and I think that's hopefully it. I think that's a beautiful way to approach, and because what does that really then, if we internalize that, I think then it hopefully makes us more humble and also more responsible. It's an interesting thing, right? Like humble in the sense that we don't really know, but responsible in the sense that we understand that what we do has repercussions. Like, we don't know what they are, but I know they matter. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know the consequences of the decisions I make tomorrow. That's humility. But what I do know is that there are going to be consequences that are far-reaching, far more than I can imagine. And they're going to affect a lot of people, for good or for ill. That's yeah.
Thank you.
Sleep well.
So one thing we say always after we get home from class, we're both